I think a lot of times when brands are in a situation where there is distress, there is this urgency to like fix things quickly or do things, whether or not there's a lot of thought behind it. It's the keep moving, keep trying. And I'm a big believer in those situations of pausing and really understanding what's at stake, what are the issues, and then responding.
This is the CMO and Joe podcast. We interview today's most inspiring chief marketing officers and savvy marketers of lucrative direct-to-consumer e-commerce companies, bringing you insightful stories and tips on marketing, sales, branding, and much more. We bring you the best lessons from the best. Let's get started with your host, Joe Momo.
Welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Joe, thanks for having me to your pod.
Absolutely. So let's jump right into it. Sure. I'm sure listeners are wanting to know who you are and what you do. So how about you give some context and light to who you are and kind of your origin story?
Sounds good. Yeah. So I'm a advertising and marketing guy by trade. Spent most of my career not most, but a good part of the early to mid part of my career in advertising, most of which was spent at Ogilvy and Mather. I worked out of the New York City office. Had an amazing experience just working with, some of the most interesting brands a guy can be lucky enough to work with. And those are, and it was a kind of a dog's breakfast of a lot of different brands and a lot of different categories, running from Ameritrade to American Express, AT&T Wireless, Cisco, Deloitte, Delta Airlines, Goldman Sachs, IBM, Motorola, Progressive Insurance, and then one of the more interesting ones was the NFL, which obviously, in today's day and age, is the NFL and sports teams in general is pretty top of mind for people as it relates to what's going on in the world today. So it really did stewarding these kinds of brands, and I had all sorts of different, challenges, these brands going from, complete turnarounds to growing new categories to how to handle, a merger or an acquisition of another brand. I really got a tremendous breadth of experiences from working with those kinds of brands at that level. So it was really a great way to sort of spend, as I said, the sort of the early to mid, part of my career, and really prepared me for the firm that I ended up starting in 2007 called Brand Value Advisors. That was a firm that was really focused on working with brands that were acquired by private equity firms. And our specialty was working with private equity firms, both when they were assessing an acquisition and helping them understand what the brand's unique contribution to value was, and how they should be thinking about whether or not to acquire it, and then what to do once they've acquired it. So that was a brand I founded. We had, when I sold it in 2016, we had about 35 folks working for us, worked on a whole host of brands. And again, as I said, both on the pre-acquisition side, so doing a lot of diligencing work with the acquisition teams on the private equity side, helping them, again, really quantify and qualify what they were looking at. And then, again, as I said, how to think about what to do with the brand once they own it. And again, our specialty was very much around the brand's contribution to value. And we had really two tranches of engagement. The first was, before a private equity firm bought the business, we developed a process by which they could really understand, the the risks and opportunities associated with that particular investment. And I'd say probably in that capacity, we worked on probably, over the course of 10 years, 600 plus deals. And then the other area of engagement was a practice which was working with the portfolio companies themselves and helping them to develop strategies, look at opportunities of growth. If the brand was challenged, how best to turn the situation around. And between those two areas of engagement, we worked on you name it. The categories ran from apparel and beauty, travel and leisure, consumer electronics, food and beverage, online education, action sports, entertainment and sports, and health and wellness. So a very broad range of categories and the kinds of brands that we engage with, whether it was on the diligence side, or whether it was on the management side of coming in and helping them develop the strategies, or even putting ourselves in a management role. So we had a pretty robust interim CMO practice where we would actually put folks inside the company, playing the role of the chief marketing officer to help really drive those opportunities or help them redirect. And those categories, or those brands ran from were wide ranging from 2U Education, Arby's, Cannondale, Deloitte, GoPro, Intermix, J. Crew, JetBlue, Lyft, NetJets, Northwestern Mutual, Old Navy, Panera Bread, Rossignol, Skull Candy, Sbarro Pizza, Spotify, Square, Tivana, Tesla, and Toomey. So really a lot of a wide-ranging group of brands with lots of different challenges. So it was a terrific experience. And as I said, sold that company in 2017. And have since then really been playing a role of on my own as an interim chief marketing officer. So typically, I'm engaged by a private equity firm that says, "Need you to come in and again, not the challenges or the mission was not too different from what we did at BVA, but I now do that as an individual." And the brand today that I'm playing that role with is Fox Racing, which is a global brand, about 40 years old, that is in the business of making apparel and gear for folks that ride motocross and mountain bikes. And so that's kind of where I am as of today. So it's been a fun ride, continues to be, and I never find it's always challenging, and there's always really interesting problems and opportunities to solve for or to take advantage of, and I can tell you in this day and age, that's more so now than ever.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. No, it seems like your background, you've had a wealth of experience working with all these high-ticket, high-name brands. Obviously, you have a lot of insights you could give to the listeners. A lot of the listeners are marketers and even small business owners. But from your perspective, how has the marketing industry changed from when you first started to now?
Well, the more things change, the more things stay the same. I think, I'm a big believer that, brand, in terms of a variable that that makes one of the variables that makes up a business. I believed this then, and I believe it more now than ever, that brand is the greatest driver of value. And if you do it well, that value doesn't have a ceiling. So I think that, if your brand is healthy, limber, nimble, and is really the focus of what you do and how you do it, that is never changed. And I think if you look at brands that are doing well and that continue to do well, brand is always at the top of the list in terms of priorities and focus. So that's I would say that's never changed. I think what is evolving is especially in this world of social mediums and platforms, how brands communicate with consumers. Before it was really more of a one-way conversation. There is no doubt today that now it is very much of a two-way conversation, and so much to the point that consumers have a very direct and active role in informing how a brand behaves. They have greater influence and impact on how a brand is positioned and how it speaks to people. And so that's I think probably the biggest change is that dialogue. It is much more democratic. It is much more of a two-way conversation with consumers having a tremendous amount of influence in how brands are stewarded and grown. And that's the thing that I work on a lot, and that the brands I work on is how do you manage a brand where the environment is much more of a two-way conversation. How do you listen? How do you react? What do you listen to? What do you take into consideration? And how do you take those inputs and feedback and continue to help a brand evolve?
Absolutely. Yeah, you kind of touched on it already with the two-way conversation and building that brand experience. But from your perspective, Mike, how do you create a great customer or even brand experience from your experience?
Be authentic. I know that that word gets thrown out around a lot. But brands, it's like brands are like friends, and the more open and honest and available you are, especially in this day and age where the brands are so exposed, and the back and forth and the mediums in which brands and consumers now communicate with each other, that's more important than ever. As David Ogilvy used to like to say, the consumer is not an idiot. The consumer is your wife. You have to treat consumers with respect. You can't fake it. They're more savvy than ever. The ages in which consumers engage with brands and develop relationships is getting younger and younger and more sophisticated. I would argue that the younger audiences are incredibly sophisticated. The American consumer, if I'm speaking, specifically, has always been a very sophisticated buyer, and they know when they are being dealt with honestly, and when they're not. And they will reward and punish you for not being, authentic and honest and real. They're very good now, more than ever, at smelling a rat. And so, really having a good foundation by which you can not only communicate to a consumer, but you can have these dialogues and the ability to listen and take in what's happening and what they're doing, how their behaviors are changing and impacting what's happening out there, and really having a really good antenna, not only to the consumers that happen to be in your category. I think category boundaries are also breaking down. I think brands more now than ever have to be very attuned to just what's happening out there in the world in general. I learn a lot from looking at other brands and other categories and what they're doing, and more now than ever, what other brands are doing in categories that aren't even necessarily relevant to you can be very instructive in how you think about your own brand in terms of communication. I always look to brands that are doing a really good job of what I just explained, understanding how that works, and then taking that, using what is relevant for us and applying it. So it's in a nutshell, brands that are doing well and what we strive to do are great listeners. They're great observers. They're very curious. They are far less dogmatic, much more open to change and listening to what's happening, and then really being able to quickly take that feedback and apply it in real time.
Absolutely, Mike. Speaking of successful, building a successful brand, what's been the most successful branding campaign you've ever worked on that maybe you can share?
Yeah, I think, and this is going a ways back to my Ogilvy days. A client of mine was IBM. This was, I'm dating myself, but going back into the late 90s. IBM at that time, was suffering from the issues that I was talking about before, which was they had lost relevancy. And some of that was not of their own making. The world was changing. We were moving from much more of an analog to a digital world and an e-commerce world. The internet was in its early stages of becoming what it is today. And IBM, this huge behemoth that you would argue invented the category of technology, was pretty rigid and pretty stuck in time, and and they were being usurped by brands that were born of a time that they were not. So think about Microsoft or Oracle or Sun Microsystems. These were brands that were incredibly relevant in the eyes of their consumers. And IBM found themselves on the outside looking in, which was incredibly frustrating for them. IBM was the king of the hill for a really long time. I think there was a lot of institutional arrogance. And they found themselves out in the cold as a brand, so much so that the business was suffering significantly. And at when we were kind of coming on, there was serious talk of breaking the business up. They had a lot of big segments that they were playing in, and a lot of analysts out there were saying that the brand itself might be more valuable in pieces than as a whole. And at that time, Lou Gerstner became the CEO, and this was a guy who came from not the technology world. He came from American Express and Nabisco. This is a cookie guy. But this gets back to the argument: is if you are a good brand person, your background matters little. Really, what matters is your ability to intuit and listen to a consumer. And Lou came in there with a learner's mentality. Again, he was not prejudiced by having a background in technology, and he looked at IBM much more as a consumer business, a consumer-facing business that it didn't matter, who the end user was. We're all still human, and need to be spoken to in terms that are relevant. And so that was sort of the table that was set when we came on the scene. And the one big issue that I think was challenging for a lot of customers out there was, how do you pivot from sort of an analog era to an e-commerce era? And a lot of clients were really, really struggling with this. And you had lots of new businesses who were out there saying, this is how you do it. This is how you do it. IBM, if you always look for where the advantage is, and IBM, regardless of its relevance, had real capabilities in working with companies to help them transform their businesses. And there was no greater transformation period than, I would argue, than that period between 1995 and, say, 2000. And brands were really struggling with how to do this. And there were a lot of new brands on the scene, but they didn't have the legacy or the experience of working with businesses at a transformational level. So we took that sort of advantage, and then we basically made the brand approachable, but also highlighted the fact that this is a big time. This is a big opportunity. There's lots of risks. There's lots of opportunities. Who better to help you with that transformation than a firm like IBM, with its reach, its technologies, its capabilities? Again, challenges around relevance and whether what they were doing mattered. But this gets down to the marketing. We pivoted the business from being really a big iron institutional IT firm to a firm that could help you migrate from the past to a real e-commerce driven world. In fact, we invented that term e-commerce. And through our, the next phase was, how do you do that in a way that is disarming, yet legitimate and qualified? And, we developed an e-commerce campaign that, mixed both our capabilities, real world issues, blended in with some humor. And it really was founded around what we call the Blue Letterbox campaign. And we just called out all these different types of scenarios and challenges that businesses were facing, and presented, what those looked like, how IBM can solve it. And we really did it, through a humorous filter. Not, haha gag, but really sort of coming from, humor of kind of a knowing humor. Like, this is a big deal. Are you going to leave it to, a .com company that, was founded 2 years ago? Are you going to leave this kind of transformation in the hands of a firm that's been around for 2 years and the average age of the employee is, 25? Or are you going to, look to a firm like IBM to help you really successfully migrate and cross this chasm? And that was the whole premise of the brand itself, and then how we communicated that proposition. And it was wildly successful. Lou Gerstner even said himself that the e-business positioning changed the game for IBM. And IBM went from, in 1995, to seriously considering breaking themselves up, to 2005 being the most valuable, most important, most relevant brand as a transformer of and a definer of how e-commerce should be working. And again, the valuation went from X billions to multi billions of dollars in value. It allowed us to, it opened up the door for IBM to get into what is now their most valuable segment, which is consulting. And the rest is history.
Yeah, absolutely. The rest is history. Thanks for that, Mike. That's really enlightening.
Sure.
I didn't know all about that IBM campaigns. Just wanted to switch gears a little bit. I wanted to get maybe some more tactical marketing insights from you. I was curious as to know what's the biggest misconception about launching a new brand or even a marketing campaign?
I think the biggest misconception is that let me think about this for a second.
Yeah, no worries.
I mean, I'm not sure if it's a misconception. I think it's a mistake. I think that still a lot of brands, and regardless of the segment, most brands feel like, or businesses feel like, brand is something that is not always a priority. Like, get the product perfect, get here's our market, here's what we're going to do. I think the misconception overall executionally is they build it before people come. And so it's built a lot around assumptions. I think companies today, because there is so much information, so much data, so much analytics, we pray to the temple of data. And I would argue that, data is obviously important, but it's directional and it's looking back, or it's sometimes can put out false negatives in terms of where the opportunity lies. And therefore, a lot of firms, one, don't put brand first, and then they tend to build their offerings around data without really having a sense of who they are and why they matter. And I think a lot of brands feel like that can be solved down the road, right? So I'll give you a really good example of a company that did this, I think, really, really well. Casper, the online mattress brand. So they came in looking to disrupt a category. You bought a mattress the same way forever. And they thought there was a different way of doing it. And it was quite different. And what they relied more on was not so much how to make an old process better. They reinvented or reimagined how consumers behave and make purchase decisions like this. And with that sort of frame of mind, they built a brand around that kind of attitude or perspective. And so they were really very much of a, brand first, versus talking about the speeds and feeds about how you actually buy the product. They looked around and saw how other categories were starting to do this based on how consumers were behaving in how they purchase things, and how old, dogmatic ways of doing things just were no longer, one, is relevant, but the consumers were much more open to trying and executing purchase behaviors than ever before. They really trusted the consumer, and I think a big mistake that brands make when they're first starting out, and even brands that are established, is the minute you sort of lose contact with the consumer, or you don't trust them, or you think you know better, you tend to, the opportunities for missing are far greater. So I think a big, mistake is building a brand from the get-go where you are not really trusting or listening to the consumer in ways that matter is probably the greatest mistake one can make. And that attitude, that attitude of trusting a consumer, of being open, those are very much brand characteristics, as much as, the color or the tonality or the look. It really is an attitude. And brands today that are doing this very, very well trust the consumer. They have a very, very rich and open, flexible and nimble relationship with the consumer. And so I think that the conception that one brand is a secondary task that can wait, I think is a big misconception and a big mistake. I think brand is really what you have to sort of understand first. And brands can evolve, but like really, what are the tenets? What do you live by? Really establishing those, baking those into the culture, baking those into the offering, baking that into the infrastructure. That really is what you have to do. You've always had to do it, but more so now than ever, just because of the world we live in.
Absolutely. It seems like listening to your audience and authenticity are like the key pillars of building a successful brand. But what do you think maybe is the most exciting marketing trend at the moment?
I'm not really a trend guy because I think trends are temporal. I think by the time you're sort of aware of a trend, it's already happening. And that's not to say that trends are not helpful and informative to, because I think you need to, again, as I said, have a very good antenna out there as to what's happening and what's going on. But I think that it's not really so much of a trend, but I think it's a way of how you look at the world now. That is, brands that are doing this really well. It is being a very, very good listener and being very open to what is happening in the world at large, and being able to disseminate those variables and making them relevant and impactful to how you are going about building your own proposition. And that's really an attitude. That's a way of looking at the world and at the consumers you live in. And I think this idea of erasing the line between a consumer and a franchise, and really being a brand that is in the room with the consumer versus outside watching them and reacting. I think that's the big change that has been happening. And brands that are doing that really well are succeeding, and brands that are that have been struggling but have changed their worldview towards what I'm talking about are finding real success. So, for example, I think Domino's, pound for pound, is the best brand out there today in terms of doing the kinds of things that we've just been talking about. They are listening. They've broken down walls. They really understand what's happening out there, and they have been able to masterfully move their brand from A to B, and really become not just relevant, but I think a brand that people want to be a part of. And I think they've been rewarded tremendously for that. I think what they've done during this COVID, I mean, no category has been more impacted, I would argue, than the food services and restaurant industry. And I think they were already on their way. Domino's was in a lot of trouble for a while around their quality control, their service, the product. And 5 or 6 years ago, they actually just sort of threw up their hands and said, listen, we're lost, consumer, help us get better. And they undertook a lot of initiatives, both internally and externally, in terms of the way they talk to the consumers, that really turned the tide in terms of, hey, brands are like people. They get lost, they make mistakes. And the difference between somebody that gets lost and makes mistakes and gets better, and those that don't, it's an attitude. You work on yourself. And I think Domino's had already been doing that for a long time, and we're already well underway in sort of their transformation. But to see that that transformation in action during this very dynamic time that we've found ourselves in the last 3 months, and it has been really fun to watch. In the way they communicate, the way they understand their consumers' concerns, what they need, how they need it, when they need it, the tone of voice. I hate this phrase that is, now kind of thrown around very lazily, which is, we are all in this together, right? Advertisers are saying that, from car companies to, to tampon manufacturers. It doesn't matter. Everyone's in this together. And it means nothing unless you really walk it. And I think Domino's, and they don't even say it. They don't have to say it. They're doing it in their deeds and not their words. And I think that is really, a brand that I look at and respect tremendously because of not only how they were able to turn the franchise around based on that way of thinking prior to COVID, and now they really have been rewarded because during this time, I think they've really been able to take those practices, those change behaviors, and really apply them greatly to their advantage.
I really love that. Do the deeds and not the words. That's definitely a quotable right there.
Yeah. And listen, it's an old adage. It doesn't, as I said, building brands are, when you ask the question, like what's changed, what more that's changed, more that's stayed the same, listen, do the right thing, some humility, some courage, it all that all adds up to authenticity and execution. And that's really, that formula hasn't changed, but it's much harder to do that than it would appear.
Absolutely. I totally agree, Mike. So I'm just curious to get your perspective as an expert in the field, but say you were launching a new brand, maybe Mike Kelly's clothing brand, and you had 50% more budget than you usually do. What are some of the things that you would spend it on, and why?
So again, I'm a bit of a contrarian here. I think I've never been a big fan of big budgets. I think big budgets tend to suppress creativity and an attitude by which you go to solve a problem. I don't think, and again, money in terms of, as a lever to get your message out there is important. But in terms of really getting to an idea that sort of encapsulates what we've been talking about, budget to me doesn't really come into the equation as much. I think that there are brands that, have grown tremendously. Take a look at, Google or, a lot of, Facebook. And now again, a lot of their, you could argue a lot of their marketing advertising is baked into their offering based on, just the scale of the usage that their customer base provides them. But whenever I hear I can't do this because I don't have enough money, that to me is lazy. I think good ideas that are executed well don't require a lot of money. That being said, if I was, I guess what I would say, rather than if I had 50% more of a budget, I think where my focus would be in terms of my activity is, people and building a group, a constituency, both internally and externally, and having the platform by which you can best deploy and take advantage of consumers that are out there and your employees. The alchemy of how that gets built, and then how it gets deployed. That's where my focus would be, and where I would be, spending money. Media today is actually relatively inexpensive. I mean, the big costs in the past, as it relates to advertising budgets, really was focused around, print advertising and TV. Now we kind of know the place that those mediums now hold. And the ways in which people get information now and share information, a lot of it is word of mouth, and a lot of it is relatively inexpensive in terms of an investment. So I think where I would focus on is the platform by which you're able to communicate, listen, and participate. That is where I would invest, and where I am investing. For instance, Fox is we're doing a great job of doing just that. We have lots of different constituents. We have people that are very passionate about our brand. They're very passionate around the activity that our brand supports. We have a lot of different influencers. There's a lot. And the investment that we're making is, how do you best aggregate that ecosystem in a way where you can listen, read, and react very quickly? And that is a lot harder said, a lot harder done than said. And that requires investment, and it requires focus. Because there's so much information and so many ways to communicate, that you can absolutely, you can't see the forest through the trees. It's almost an embarrassment of riches. And how you are able to set up a platform where you can disseminate what matters, what doesn't matter, and then be able to act on that. That's where I think the real investment should be made.
Absolutely there, Mike. I'm enjoying our conversation. I think I'm just listening to all your great insights. I do only have a couple more questions here for you.
Sure.
You mentioned what Fox is doing, but I'm curious to know what can you share that Fox Racing is doing that maybe some people or listeners don't know about?
Well, I think Fox was started by a family in the mid '70s. It is a passion-based business. People are absolutely dedicated, committed. There's a lot of love for the activities that Fox supports. Whether you're on a mountain bike or whether you're on a motorcycle, it's a very passion-driven, very committed pursuit on the part of our consumers. And I would argue that it has always been, we eat our own dog food. Most of the people that are in the Fox community in terms of a business have been riding motorcycles or mountain bikes, all their lives. So, they are as equally passionate and committed as the customers that we serve. And that's a family. And so I think the thing that we're doing a very good job of is, Fox doesn't have an awareness problem. In fact, when we've done research, it arguably pound for pound, we have, awareness ratings that, are right in there with, the Apples and the Googles, of the world and the Nikes of the world. What we need to impart and to promote and to encourage and to recognize is that the pursuit by which we serve is very much of a family. If you can be recognized as part of that family and understanding, the needs, the quirks, the ups, the downs, the pros and cons, family's family, right? There's all sorts of elements that go into a family. And what we've been doing, I think, a fantastic job of, because we are the leader in the category, is really promoting and encouraging and celebrating this notion of that this is a family pursuit. We have a role in that pursuit that's very, very important. We understand what that role is and what we have to do in order to make other members of our family excited, encouraged, motivated to do their best in what they're doing. And so I think that's been from a brand perspective, that's been the thing that we've really looked to focus on and to celebrate.
Awesome to know.
It's worked out very well for us because, we're a retail business and we have, and that family includes our distributors and our retailers, not just the people that work inside the four walls of Fox or the folks that are buying our products. We have salespeople, distributors, they have their own challenges. Being a retailer in this day and age is harrowing. And so we are part of that family. They're, a lot of them are looking to us, not just as a brand that provides a product that people really love and want, but how can we help all of our members of our family, thrive during this time as best as they can. And I would argue that our sales have been impacted, but I don't think they've been impacted to the extent that other brands that don't have, this sort of positioning or attribute and attitude around understanding, that this is a collective effort. We have to support each other, again, very much like a family.
Absolutely. It has that family dynamic and it always perseveres through whatever times you're going through. To end the podcast, what we usually like to do is obviously marketing and branding is all about identity and standing for something and having a voice. So what we like to do is ask our guests, what's the most unpopular or even out of the box stance you've ever taken and why?
Well, I've done this a few times with a few different brands, which is, there's, and this has been in, I'm involved in a lot of turnaround situations. There's a phrase, when you're in hell, keep going, or, when you're in a hole, stop digging. I think a lot of times when brands are in a situation where there is distress, and it's not just brands, I think this is human nature. There is this urgency to fix things quickly, or do things, whether or not there's a lot of thought behind it. It's the keep moving, keep trying. And I'm a big believer in those situations of pausing and really understanding, what's at stake, what are the issues, and then responding. That is, to a lot of people, very counterintuitive, because it connotes that you're not doing anything. When in fact, you are doing something. You are stopping, you are thinking, you are kind of putting all the distractions and the pressures aside for a moment. I'm not saying you sit back for a year and put your feet up. I mean, you're working and you're trying to figure it out. But in terms of going to market, really stopping to understand what the issues are. And so the contrarian sort of counterintuitive instinct that I have in those situations is to stop. I have, where there's been a product that, needs to get out because it has to get out because we've invested and this is when it's supposed to go out, even though there are problems with it or whether the market is challenged. I've said a lot of times, stop, pause, think it through, get a real game plan together, and then execute. And I have never been in a situation where that has not yielded a better result than to just continue to sort of swing around in the dark for the sake of swinging.
I love that. Take a moment, take a pause, and just take a moment to reflect and see where your positioning is at. I love that. I love that advice. Mike, it's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast. You've obviously had lots of great insights, and I'm sure the listeners will have a great time listening. Just to wrap up the podcast, where can the listeners connect with you online if they have some follow-up questions or even just see what you're up to?
Best way to reach me is email, mkelly, M as in Mike, Kelly, 1646 @gmail.com.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mike. It's been a pleasure.
You too. Take care.
This episode of the CMO and Joe podcast has ended, but be sure to subscribe for more business strategies and tactics to help you create the profitable and successful business you've always dreamed of. And don't forget to rate and review so we can continue to bring you the best content. See you on the next episode.